Not that hardcore, I'm afraid.
All right, I'm letting everybody in now. Lovely, look at all of those faces. Just letting the last couple of people in. Awesome. Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Tonight we have Asher Wolf in conversation with Royce Kurmelovs discussing Royce's new book, Just Money, Misadventures in the Great Australian Debt Trap. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand you over to our first speaker this evening, I'd just first quickly like to reiterate some of the information that was mentioned to you in the email that you were sent earlier with the link to join tonight's event. So you've all automatically been placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening. However, that doesn't mean that we won't be having a Q&A session. It will just look a little bit different. So if you use the chat box, which you will find towards the lower left of your screen, you can type your questions for Royce in there and they'll come straight through to me and I'll read them out along with your name towards the end of the evening. I also want to mention that we have a special promotion on at the moment, which is that if you use the code EVENT on our website when placing an order, you'll receive 10% off. I'll be posting the link to purchase your copy of Just Money in that chat box that I was just talking about very soon. So I recommend that you get in early and make the most of that 10% discount. So I'd now like to hand you over to Aviva Tuffield, who is co-founder of the Stella Prize and one of the publishers at UQP, and would like to say a few words before the conversation ensues. So Aviva, over to you.
Thank you, Emma Kate, and thank you all for being here tonight. Firstly, I too would like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to thank Avid Reader Bookstore for hosting this in conversation and for all that they do to champion authors and books, especially in 2020. Independent bookstores such as Avid Reader are the lifeblood of the literary community, so please support them with your book purchases. I just wanted to say a few words before the conversation begins, because this is Royce's first online event since his wonderful book, Just Money, was published earlier this month. We at UQP are extremely proud of Royce and this book. It's a result of deep research, thorough journalistic investigation, and sheer hard work. When Royce and I first started talking about this book, it was much more focused on corporate corruption and rapacious business practices and the Banking Royal Commission in particular, and less on debt and indebtedness as phenomena. Once Royce realised that debt in all its forms was his subject matter, it became apparent just how important, timely, and universally relevant this book would be. And that was before a pandemic enveloped the world and put every section of society under financial pressure. Yet, as Royce points out in the book, an external shock was inevitable and has just confirmed how fragile the situation already was and how prescient this book actually is. This is a thought-provoking, powerful, and humane book, one that deserves a wide readership. Congratulations, Royce. I'd now also like to introduce Asher Wolf, who has kindly agreed to be in conversation with Royce here tonight. Asher Wolf is a data rights activist whose work focuses on the intersection of technology and human rights. In 2012, they founded Crypto Party, a decentralized privacy-focused movement. Asher was a lead organizer on the campaign against robo-debt, which was recently found to be unlawful via a high court case, and a class action is pending. Asher is, and I quote, a feral chaos magnet, I love that, who revels in making architects of oppressive systems uncomfortable. And she is also a recipient of an Amnesty Human Rights Media Award. And to the man of the night, Royce Kurmelovs is a journalist and writer whose work has been published by the ABC, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera English, Vice, The Guardian, and The Saturday Paper, amongst many others. Royce's best-selling first book was The Death of Holden and was published in 2016. He subsequently published Rogue Nation and Boom and Bust. And now we have this fantastic new book, Just Money, which Asher and Royce will now discuss. Over to you two. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Aviva.
So I am here from unceded Wurundjeri land as well, and I also pay my respects to the leaders past, present and future. I first spoke to Royce in regards to robo-debt. Royce didn't really fill me in much about the book at the time, but I am honoured to have the opportunity to chat with him today about his wonderful new book, Just Money. Royce, I have to tell you that when I first looked at this book, I thought, oh my God, I think I'm going to have a panic attack because I am terrified of the concept of debt, really terrified. And that's something that's pervasive throughout your entire book. Can you tell me a bit about the process of terror and grief and guilt that accompanies debt?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a very fair and realistic observation about debt. I mean, debt is something that has a long, long history. And in terms of that sense of guilt and frustration and terror, that's been, it goes so far as to have been hardwired into our language. The word for debt, depending how far you go back, in German was the word for guilt. The word for credit has a long history in Italian that goes back to, that you can tie to things like, the credo, the Italian profession of faith. And so the more, and so this is one of the interesting things about debt and learning about it, because when I found myself in debt and then began learning about it, you began to, this whole other world began to kind of appear, and this understanding that, well, there's a reason why we feel this way. There's a reason why we react this way. And there's a reason why we feel kind of, bad. So, it was a really interesting learning process as well, because coming to understanding debt intellectually, understanding that guilt aspect, the morality aspect, and how much that borrows from religion and religious, doctrine, was one thing. But also at the same time I was learning about this intellectually, I was also kind of living it and experiencing it, and that was a very hard thing to process for a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I think the thing that often captures people is that there's a sense of this being a very personal issue. But on the other side, the banks, the financial institutions are almost speaking a foreign language. And I myself definitely feel that way when I think about financial products. I don't understand what's being offered. I don't understand what's a fair price. I don't understand the legalese, so I don't understand the terms and conditions. And then I don't understand the ways of gaining access to redress if something goes wrong. And I think the thing that I really noticed reading your book was this sense of an attempt to capture an understanding of the system. It was almost like learning a foreign language for you. Can you talk to that?
Absolutely. And I'm not a finance guy. I'm a journalist. I don't have any particular training in this area, and I'm very careful to say that because I'm not an economist. I don't understand this intuitively. But then when you learn about this stuff, none of this is particularly this stuff is made deliberately complicated and hard to pass, because this is how people make six-figure salaries, being able to interpret some of the stuff. And one of the challenges in putting together the book was being able to read widely, try to penetrate these financial documents, penetrate these ideas and this theory, and then put it together in a way that makes sense, and in a way that's essentially plain English. And that was a very difficult process because, like you say, a lot of this is abstract, it's intangible, it's complicated, it's legalistic, and it's not easy. And I think that lack of transparency and accountability is how that we wind up in problems, and how we wind up with people in financial institutions getting away with a lot of nonsense. I mean, if you think of, and as was mentioned, we recently had the whole banking, the Royal Commission into the banking industry, and that was an exploration into how some of this stuff came out, and that pulled out a lot of stuff that for a lot of people was incredibly shocking. But then I guess what was, and this is what goes to kind of that interesting thing about debt, is that when you think about debt and think about the Royal Commission in the context of debt, the Royal Commission was a blip in a much larger story. It was a small chapter. And once you start seeing that broader structure, that broader narrative that we are kind of living, a lot of stuff starts to make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Are we allowed to talk spoilers in this book? Or shall we stay away from spoilers?
I'm okay with spoilers. You know, knowing how the cake is made doesn't make it taste any less good. So, you know.
So you write about the history of debt, which is absolutely fascinating, and you write about a particular woman who has ended up in debt over her petticoats, and that the tragedy of the outcome for this particular woman, over a piece of material, a piece of fabric, just to wear as underwear. It was so shocking to me, but at the same time, it was so close to home that, you know, it's so easy to get screwed essentially on thinking that you've got a deal and then the deal changing like quicksand under your feet. We even see it in the Royal Commission where cases come up where people believe that they've made deals, that they've cut, you know, a reasonable outcome with a bank, and then the bank says, nah, fuck it, you know, do what we want, you know. I think it was the Lowe family in particular that had multiple loans during the Royal Commission, and you see them desperately trying to come to a warm, gentle understanding with a system that essentially wants to crush them, that just wants the money and doesn't care how they get it, and they want the best outcome for the bank, and they just couldn't care less if that absolutely destroys somebody.
I mean, inherent to that is also the assumption from the finance industry that every person is able to handle their finances as if they were a little accountant or a, you know, or a trained financial, you know, a sophisticated financial professional, and you know that is fundamentally wrong. Like people don't, people work 9 to 5s. People have, you know, division of labor means that you go and do your thing, whatever that thing is. You know, to then go and spend, you know, your time thinking about your personal finances like an accountant would or an investor is a huge ask of people when they're just trying to get by. You know, and it's been a really interesting, that insight was really interesting, as learning how the world had been remade to make it buyer beware and to say, well, right, well, you're on your own with this stuff. And if you can't handle it, well, then that's your fault. And so even within those little exchanges, you get all that morality stuff. You get that, you know, that atomization, that process of making it all about your individual ability to do whatever it is. That was always kind of never a thing.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that we're expecting people who have poor levels of maths literacy, who may be working gig economy, who have never finished, you know, basic introduction to accounting, to manage essentially complicated businesses. As soon as you become part of the gig economy, you're essentially a business owner, you're a sole trader, and the average person has no idea how that will impact like a fast juggling circus of things that they're then going to have to be responsible for. And that shone through, particularly with robo-debt. People weren't aware of what the outcomes would be of taking multiple pieces of jobs or moving over the threshold in payments. A lot of this was outside people's control and played a very large element. But then, on top of it, the way in which the system had been gamed to essentially ensure that people failed, that was the heartbreaking thing. Fate can be ruthless, but to engineer a system that purposefully goes out to screw people, that's really offensive, and that's worth fighting. And yeah.
Well, and this is the really interesting thing, because what you're getting at is a very profound and very large scale structural change that took place over a period of just, you know, half a century, really. So like, and we've discussed this at length. So like, you know, it's you know, post World War II, and the really simple, like the really complicated name for this is a thing called macroeconomic regimes. It's really boring, but the very simple metaphor for this is from a guy called Mark Blyth, who's a political economist, and he described it like, right, so you ran world economies like they were a computer. You had the software and the hardware. And then, you know, you ran a certain software for a certain set of time that did some things. And after World War II, that was, you know, full unemployment, guaranteed wage increases, high levels of unionization, lots of public housing, you know, lots of, you know, public healthcare. That meant that if you made mistakes, that meant that if you were, you didn't have to be brilliant to handle your finances in that period. But if you made a mistake, it wasn't the end of the world, because what was happening is, yes, your debts may be large. You may be paying an 18% interest rate on your mortgage, but you're getting guaranteed wage rises over the time. And so what happened was, that whatever debts you had shrunk as a proportion of your income. And that's a complicated concept to understand, but it basically meant that all you had to do was be alive at that time. You made out like bandits. Whereas but the problem with running that system is that it contains bugs. And once you run it for long enough, those bugs start to show. So what do? You wipe it and install a new software. And that came out in the 1980s, and that was that neoliberal compact and all the things that came with the rest of it. But at that point, it made it all about you, all about your personal finance and your ability to do this. And if you failed, that was your fault. And here we are. And that shows up, and as you say, actually really interestingly in the robo-debt stuff. And this is kind of what brought me to you in the first place, is because I was really interested in how that kind of financial logic that has come together, that has penetrated society so thoroughly, was being applied to something like the social security system that has been and should be just a right citizenship.
And so that system that changed the code in the 1980s, it wasn't just intergenerational, it was class-based. So you see people like my mother, who had thought that she was doing fine, was investing, was flipping houses, whatever. I remember as a child growing up without a roof because we were renovating and building the place around us as we went, because that's what sensible people did. They worked 9 to 5, and then on the weekend and the evenings.
Sorry, Asha, I don't want to interrupt you. Can you lean a bit closer to your microphone? I'm getting a few messages from people who are struggling to hear.
Sorry, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, that seems better. That's focusing. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, as a child, my parents would, try and build around us while they were working. So we would go and pick up rubble on the building site, and then we'd try and sell it. And that was the way that my parents thought that they were doing okay. And the 80s came along and leveled them to some degree. And after my parents got divorced, it wasn't another 10 years till I found out that my mum had got hit by a robo-debt. And that was part of why I was so angry, was that mum was the one who got hit by a robo-debt. And she was that lady who kept all of her files, who had an accountant, who thought that she knew what she was doing, but she had, it was a false debt essentially, and it was pre-2015, so she'll never get it back. But that was part of what made me so angry about these systems, was that, if you look historically, debts could be discharged. You could go bankrupt, the slate could be wiped clean. But with government debts like robo-debt, you're a debtor forever. You can rack up $80,000 in debt, in false debt even, and it will never be wiped unless you pay it off. They won't discharge it.
It follows you around.
Yep, for life.
Yeah. And like putting that in context with this broader kind of indebtedness of Australian society, I mean, that's the thing. It's yet another pitfall about what makes this so problematic. But it's even worse because it should be like the social security system should be there to help you up, not kick you while you're down. And that, I think, I mean, and you worked on this stuff. You were one of the people who were organizing around this. So you know as well as I do. But like, I think, I mean, and from talking to you, it was clear like that was the injustice behind it, is the sense that this was, and I think you use these words, a tax on upward social momentum. It made that so you could not get up and do better with your life, and it brought you back down. No matter where you went, no matter how well you were doing, suddenly you were back involved with Centrelink again.
Right. It was an attack on class mobility. It was a tax on upward mobility. As soon as you pass that threshold of, whether it was 45,000 or 55,000 where they'd set it, you triggered a whole bunch of alarms where you might lose family tax benefit, you might have to start repaying HECS, because you're in a higher threshold, you're entitled to less on other payments like childcare, and immediately you're on the hook for more potential debt. Essentially, the more times you have interaction with a system, a government system, the more likely you are to end up with a robo-debt. I think it's slightly similar with financial products. The more financial products you take on, the more likely you end up screwed as well. And I think part of that for me is a decision as an adult not to go into debt by living like a pauper as an adult, which has been difficult over the years. It would be nice to, I dream about taking on credit lines or, taking a mortgage or something like that. That would be, it's inconceivable to me because I just know I'd never be able to pay it back.
And I mean, and that's another component of this as well. So that intergenerational divide and that breakdown of intergenerational bargain, where you see young people are more likely to inherit their parents' debts instead of inheriting assets. I mean, when you and that's another portion of this is when we talk about that, it often gets misread or misarticulated as boomer bashing, saying, "Oh well, our parents, had it so good, everything's great, now it sucks." But I think the defining schism there is class, not necessarily age, because what you said, I think, like you said with your mom, right, where a lot of people, robo-debt affected people of multiple age brackets. This sense of easy credit was appealed to people of multiple age brackets. It didn't matter how old you were if you didn't have the income. If you wound up into trouble. We were sold this idea that you can use a loan to solve everything, and if you fell into trouble, suddenly you're dealing with debt collectors, the government was coming after you for bills, financial institutions were trying to take your house. But the people who benefit from this are those who essentially lend that money, the people who are creditors, the people or people who are associated with institutions somehow. And that's what makes, I think, when you put debt over this landscape, it's what makes this so revealing and so insightful, because it changes the way we think about the issues that are in front of us, and it puts a really fascinating context over everything.
So can we talk a bit about the shame that comes with it and why we then go into that shutdown mode around financial issues? So Holly Hughes, I think it was, the senator, talked about people putting their heads in the sand the other week in regards to robo-debt, and you talk in your book around people who end up with debt responding like frozen prey, essentially. And really that's what people are. They're prey of a system and a beast that they don't really understand. And yet we blame them for it. It's very much a victim blaming system. You write about talking to your mum about debt and the fear and the guilt that came with that. And I could feel myself clench up inside thinking that would have been me, having that conversation with my mum. And it keeps us atomized as well, that we're all afraid of talking about how we got screwed or what mistake we made because we didn't understand, because it's assumed that we should understand and that we should know these systems that are impenetrable to us.
Absolutely, and there was this great moment in researching the book that that kind of crystallized all that, and that was around the time of the Banking Royal Commission, and the ABC had on the stockbroker to talk about this, and this guy was ostensibly on the program, and probably is very sympathetic to people who are in bad financial circumstances or who have found themselves in trouble. But this guy, when he was talking about it, went on this 30-second rant about how I think the words he used are, we can't hold your hand like a baby. You have to start asking these questions and learn for yourself. You have to find out what your super is. You have to find out what's in the contract. And there's this whole spiel that even a guy who was kind of speaking in defense of victims is also blaming people for their own misfortunes. And so it was this weird kind of gaslighting where it's and that is in itself only interesting because that only exists because of a set of ideas around debt and how it works. And I mean, and for me, I guess that moment of having to talk to to my mom and to other people about this, and to say, look, this terrible thing happened. I made a mistake. It would cost me $20,000. I'm still dealing with it. Was hard. For a long time, I did not tell mom. I lied. Because it was easier. I didn't want her to worry, and as I say in the book as well, that's a conversation that has happened many times throughout history. This idea that mom, dad, I've made a mistake, and I'm on the hook for it, and like you rightly say, that sense of fear and that shame and that fight or flight response that happens in the moment of confrontation when someone comes and says, "Hey, you owe us a lot of money," means that we shut, it means that it means that we have that natural human response to shut down, to prefer not to deal with it, to prefer to either run or hide or just get angry and fight. And this is, I guess, in a practical sense, that's not very useful or helpful in dealing with a situation, but it also means that we never compare notes. We never talk to our friends, we never talk to our family, we never find out, what everyone's going through. And that was one of the interesting things in research in the book, because the more I talked to people, the more I went around and started asking them, hey, what's going on? The more that people had their own stories of being in debt. The more that they were like, hey, you should talk to my friend who's who's had this horrible situation, and is in debt. And that's when you run up with incredibly powerful stories. One woman I spoke to, she's in her 20s. She spoke about how when she was living in northern Queensland, she was in a domestic violence household and needed to fund her escape somehow. And basically, she couldn't get access to Centrelink because that had long, like the conditions to access Centrelink had long been tightened. So in order to get out, she got herself a credit card, and then she spent the next half decade paying off that credit card from then on. And I think that's really important in terms of thinking about debt and thinking about people's response to it, because what you get out of that story, and more broadly, is this sense that people are being forced to make choices between risks. Do I get out of a potentially dangerous situation using a credit card and deal with the stuff later, or do I stay and be harmed? Do I put money in the tank for my car tomorrow so I can get to work and make more money, or do I pay my registration and risk being pulled over by the police? And it's at that point that people on a certain level of the income spectrum start making choices between A or B, and then and the more you do that, eventually something blows up.
So I quite often see amongst other mothers, other young parents, people talking about living frugally. Ways to cut down on food bills, because food is often the biggest expense in my generation. If you look at your daily budget, it's what's costing you the most. And people are like, if you stand in this queue at this time of day, they chuck out the ends of the salami, or if you go to this part of the market at this time of day, you can get a $5 box of food. But there's also a trade-off again, which is time, which costs you work time. It means that you can't, emotionally unwind if that's your time off from work as well. And there's also the aspect of health and safety. So you see people progressively going along a spectrum where they end up with a diet that's essentially some green potatoes and porridge and beans and rice. And this isn't a good outcome either. We're looking at a societal situation where people aren't aware that other people are all in the same situation, or multiple people are in the same situation as them, because nobody ever stops and says, well, why is it this way? Why should food banks be handing out food that's already going moldy from Coles? Why is that acceptable that in 2020, when you go to get a handout of food, that it's quite often fruit and veg that already will be wilted and, will have that sweet stench of going rotten. I think there's a devaluation of human lives and quality of life that accompanies this, that, they've made choices about people's worth, and that's also built into the system. Like, just live cheaper, just be more frugal with your income, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't add up, and the maths doesn't add up. It's a fraud.
And there's a name for this, and it's called an austerity politics, and that applies down at, applies at the level of entire countries, but also at the level of individual people. It's this idea that, well, that's okay, just budget your way out of poverty or budget your way out of debt. And again, through researching the book, the thinking around this crystallized for me, right? This idea, and you see this in a lot of policy responses to indebtedness, to financial strife, which is, oh, well, the solution is financial literacy. It's just teaching people to be better with their accounts or their money. Personally, I find that very patronizing. And the way I think about this, and the way I've come to think about this, thanks to a friend who pointed out to me, is that, like the barefoot investor, right? Apparently, all accounts, lovely guy, has has helped a lot of people with their finances, provide a few rule of thumb guides, great for educating people. Now, this guy sold over 1 million books. But even though we sold over 1 million books, we're still in a situation where Australians particularly are more indebted than ever, who are having to choose, having to like go without food, having to go with poor quality food, who are finding themselves deeper and deeper into poverty as the stuff that as the goods that they buy is short term and is and like the quality of their food, the quality of their clothing breaks down over time. But it's and I think
I'm laughing at you because I'm laughing at you because I'm sitting here and my couch is falling apart, and I put a cover over my couch, and I put on the pearls that I never wear that sit in the cupboard, and it's part of the sham appearance of like we've still all got it together, just fake it till you make it. And really the reality is that I think a lot of people like me are aware that things are right up against the line at the moment.
And I mean, and that's fundamentally at issue here, because this problem is not necessarily individual, and it can't be solved with individual solutions. We need it's a structural problem that requires people to deal with this at the level of government, at the level of policy. And I guess the good news is that it can be fixed if we want to.
Yeah, I don't think the government has the will to fix it, though. I think that they're quite happy in keeping it going as it is. Robo-debt is a prime example of how we know that something isn't working. We know that how the system is fraudulent. We know that the system is hurting people. We know that the system is losing money, and they still implement it anyway. And not only do they implement it, but when it's pointed out that it's not working and that it's fraudulent and that it's hurting people and that it's killing people, they then say, no, it's fine, we'll just tweak it a bit and keep it going. And that's where we are today with robo-debt. I don't know how to change things except by perhaps pushing people to become more radicalized in the actions they take. And I've definitely seen that with the creation and the upward membership numbers in the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, and I'm really happy to see that, and the formation of other little groups on Twitter that are showing younger activists how to organise. I think it's really important.
Well, and that's also what drew me to robo-debt as well, because I think that even though it is not totally a happy story, even though that this stuff continues, it's still going on, I think that in the way that the campaign around robo-debt organized, that contains lessons for how this stuff may change, at least from a bottom-up approach. Because I mean, it was the work of people who were on the ground, who did the legwork, who made this an issue, who pushed it, who laid the groundwork for the parliamentary inquiries. That even if it hasn't fixed it, it still has made an incredible change. I mean, we're now in a position where it's universally acknowledged that whole system was illegal and it was a total colossal screw-up. And that would not have happened were it not for that legwork. But I think the value in that is that what it taught everyone who was involved, it taught people that the way out of this is to work together. It taught people about their rights. It taught people how the system of parliament works, how parliamentary inquiries work, how to write letters, how to do activism that's effective in 2020. And I think all of those things are incredibly valuable in terms of building the capabilities for that kind of for that kind of activism going forward. And I think that's actually kind of illustrative in a lot of ways.
Right. And I do worry though, because when you look at these systems, the elements that are constantly there is one of surveillance and policing. So whether it's debt in private corporations or whether it's debt in government debt, all of them will have, whether it's Panthera doing debt collection or Pro Group doing collections, or Dun & Bradstreet doing collections, or whether they're hiring them again in other contexts to do optical surveillance. So I've been looking at the tenders recently. The fence line of how they herd people together and how they ensure that people are trapped into these systems is essentially surveillance and policing.
Well, yeah, and I guess that's another, function of when you look at debt, it enables this stuff. And I think that the way this plays out on an interpersonal and personal level is that it makes people angry, and it compounds the anger over time. It makes people frustrated, and it makes people want to do something. But and I guess everything you've just outlined is an indication about how these systems are in some ways getting worse, and how, like, I mean, what happened with robo-debt, the fight that was against robo-debt isn't over. But I think fundamentally you still have a cohort of people who were organized, trained, learn that they can have an effect in the world, and those people aren't going to go anywhere. And the more that that sentiment and that knowledge spreads through these kind of movements, the better off we'll be, because it becomes harder and harder to sustain these systems of surveillance and policing and pressure that this incredible indebtedness places upon us. I mean, and it's not just the robo-debt campaign as well. I mean, we did have a royal commission into the whole banking industry that our ruling coalition desperately tried to stop. People who, and these are people who, and that was pushed by a coalition of farmers in northern Queensland who are written off as kind of people who don't know anything. And they were the ones who did a lot of the legwork to lay the groundwork for the Royal Commission. So I guess the hopeful element of this is that it is possible to change stuff. We made the world this way. We can unmake it and remake it. And if we lose sight of that, that's when we lose.
Right. So when you look back at something like Occupy versus AUW or the Not My Debt campaign, if you had to pick a campaign, where would you pick a campaign right now for this moment in time?
I'm not sure you can pick a campaign, because I mean, both have their different their advantages. So Occupy began in kind of the US in relation to also debt, funnily enough. But because the US as a society is a different culture, there are more people there, they're more connected, they're more able to meet up. In Australia, we're limited by geography. You're stuck in coastal cities that are around a massive continent, and that makes it really hard to network and to organize. And so, but the connection between both of those, if you think about them both as reactions and fights against widespread, massive indebtedness, as a kind of rebellion even, like, they both make much more sense, and they both use the tactics and the opportunities and the tools that they had around for the best result they could possibly get. I mean, Occupy shut down entire cities, and I was in the US when they were doing that. Here, Not My Debt, the AUWU, and the various other activist groups who were involved in this they have got to the point where they've proved that robo-debt was illegal and people are getting refunded. That's something, and that's something to hold on to. And that will happen again. I guess that the other issue, though, is that the risk, if you want to talk about a threat matrix, is that you've got people like, Pauline Hanson, who can turn up, who don't really know anything, who will say the obvious thing, and then go, oh, by the way, it's the reason why you're angry is also because of all these immigrants over here. So I
know that we've talked about this before, about the fact that we have leftist parties or supposedly progressive parties who call themselves progressive, and yet they're unwilling to talk about poverty, about debt, about reform of the APS and policy and governance systems that relate to financial products. And meanwhile, yes, Pauline Hanson rocks up and says, oh, these are my people, come to me. And it's like, if you don't take the ground when it's being offered to you, some bloody racist will. And that's what I really strongly want to say to the ALP and the Greens and any other party, whether it's even the socialists, like, take it when it's offered to you. If activists offer you a campaign, which we did over and over again, and really the first person who picked up robo-debt was Wilkie as an independent. And we really had to push it over a number of 3 years before other parties got involved. We definitely did have Senator Seaworth got involved really early and really strongly, but we got dribs and drabs from other particular politicians. They'll come in, they'll come out. But really, at the end of the day, it was very difficult to get politicians on board. And I'm hoping that this will change with time, that they'll recognise that these sort of campaigns that are going to come up again, particularly with the Australian Unemployed Workers Union now, with things like farm labour, for instance, or even the one-touch payroll stuff that will come in December. We need politicians that are willing to push back. And if they don't push back, activists will push them out.
And arguably that's going to happen. I mean, debt is like widespread indebtedness are the two conditions for rebellion. It produces a sense of, a sense that there is nothing to lose, and moral outrage. And it's just a question of who seizes it. I mean, how are we doing for time, by the way? Is there questions, or what's the?
What time do we?
We have a few questions coming through, yeah, but you've still got time if you wanted to carry on talking for a little bit, or we can go to questions now if you'd
I have
like.
a question about aftermath of this book, because you write about how it ate up time in your life. When you deal with like what you did, which was exploring a huge foreign country, which is essentially debt and financial products, through your own very personalized trauma, it eats up your life. You're in a state of shock at first, and then you're in this whole new land trying to get your bearings, and then you're figuring it out. But tell me about, where do you go from there? How do you see the world after that experience of coming through this?
And you're very right. I mean, the word for this is time horizons. So what it does, when you have these debts, you're constantly thinking about it. You're constantly thinking about how you're going to make those repayments, where the money's going to come from. Even when it's all sorted, it's still in the back of your mind. And multiple people told me that it makes them angry how much time they spent thinking about their debts. There's one story in the book that I think that was very profound about this. One of the people I spoke to talked about how their life went from thinking about the world in terms of months and years, and condensed down to thinking about the world in a matter of hours and days. There was a story where he said that, look, he once he and his wife lost everything. They lost house. They had to move away. They had their credit card debt sold. They were living in South Australia. Went to, they would take their kids to a basketball game. And so he knew that on Wednesday night at, say, 6 p.m., the money would land in his account, and the basketball game was at 7. So he would drive to the ATM about 5:30, wait out the front, refresh his account summary, and just wait for the money to land in his account so he can withdraw $20 to go take his kids to the basketball. And what that does is it makes you unable to plan. It makes you unable to think ahead. It makes you unable to imagine tomorrow or the next day or next week or next month. And it's very hard for people to do that. Another couple I spoke to who were coming out of their debt scenario, they were talking about how, like, even though they were already on the way out of it, they could not imagine next year. It was looking like that everything will be great by next year, but they could not imagine what it would be like or what they would do with themselves. Whether I asked them, would you go for a nice dinner? They said, well, we're not even thinking about that. And for me personally, it was also I had a very similar experience. I mean, for me, it was something I thought about, something I was, and this is the weird thing, right? So in doing the book, in using that personal narrative as a way into the book, there was almost this kind of curiosity. I'm writing about debt to get out of debt. But then at the process of intellectually understanding it as I'm living through it, as I'm actually going step by step, arguing with the insurance company I was dealing with, doing the research, doing the preparation, planning about how much it's going to cost me, knowing how much it's going to cost me and planning about how I'm going to pay that, that took up all of my life for 18 months. And that slowly begins to eat away at your ability to just function cognitively. And the more I learned intellectually about what I was seeing, the more I was able to understand this finance stuff, and looking at the experience and hearing about the experiences of other people as well, who were in very similar and arguably worse situations because they had less capacity and less support to deal with these things. I mean, for me, the response was anger, and to become increasingly angry over time. And today, now that things are kind of sorted and stabilized, it's a really interesting place to be in, because I look back and it's a time I would like to forget. I would like to leave to one side, but also it's a reality that I'm still making payments. It's something I've still got to think about and manage going forward, even now. And I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Maybe we need to make sure your book sells so you can pay it off immediately.
I mean, it would help. But
I don't know. I as well feel this sense of, it's more than anger. Watching robo-debt unfold broke a sense of faith that there is any egalitarianism or fairness in the systems in which we're living within. And it probably radicalized me more than anything else that I've worked on in the last 10, 15 years. And you look at places like Woomera, you look at places, some of the protests that I've been involved in over the last decade. But the sense that a system, just like Woomera did to refugees, it just says, well, fuck you because we can. And financial systems are much the same. Well, fuck you because we can. And police know where to go.
And I think it's also, it goes back to what we were saying at the very start, the unaccountable, the untransparent way in which these things are discussed, the use of acronyms, the use of like this very technical language, the inability to actually read this stuff, means that the people who make these decisions, who build these institutions, often have are already 100 steps ahead. They are very aware about what they're doing at the cutting edge of finance, and some of it's very interesting. Like, I mean, in a purely abstract sense, it is actually very interesting when you start to think about it, right? Because you think to yourself, wow, there's a line in the book where I describe it as becoming more sophisticated and worse. Like, this stuff became more complicated, it became more intellectually interesting, but also it became increasingly just detached from the people on the ground, the people who are living this stuff, and it turned and I think I think that massive knowledge gap enables these institutions to act in ways that are fundamentally disadvantages the average person. This is where it comes back to, well, what do you do about this? Part of it is like, you cannot just treat this as an issue of just educate people, make them understand this more, because that helps. Teaching people about their rights, teaching people about appeals, teaching them how to stand up for themselves, building that capability is important. But also, like, we've built an environment where mistakes cost a lot of money, and there is no way out of those mistakes because incomes aren't rising, things are stagnating, the inability to get a good quality job is not there. If you wanted to deal with this, that's the way to tackle this for the greatest number of people as quickly as possible.
But we can see that they don't want to do that. We're aware that they'll lose hundreds of thousands of jobs when they cut JobSeeker even. And they would rather cut JobSeeker and lose hundreds of thousands of dollars millions of dollars, and lose hundreds of thousands of jobs than keep the basic support going to ensure that people's well-being is sustained.
Well, I mean, and that's a current issue now that will resolve itself in some way. How that will resolve itself, we don't know yet, because that is, a reality. Yeah, that's a future, and there's multiple futures at stake. I mean, just as things could be very good, they could also be very bad. And right now, essentially, we've gone through a crisis. The people in charge are going to remake our lives in a certain way following that crisis. I mean, the question is whether each of us are willing to allow that to happen. And like I said, there's a tension here, because I feel like there's a very easy willingness to give in to that kind of despair and that frustration and those entrenched, there's entrenched interests who act for themselves at our expense. But I also don't think that you can just what are we going to do? Lie down and let it happen? Like, no. I mean, it's
the first question that when we realized some time ago that they weren't going to cut JobSeeker and that they were not going to ensure that people were okay was, well, what are we going to do? Do we strike? Do we occupy offices? And so those conversations are already beginning to happen. How do you push back against a government that won't engage in polite conversation about human rights and basic life necessities?
And what's interesting this time around in terms of the future going forward is that with JobKeeper particularly, you have a situation in which, people have talked about it in kind of commentary about Robodebt 2.0, this idea that, businesses applying for this, some who are acting dishonestly, some who are not, are going to wind up in a situation where the ATO comes after them for a debt owed by JobKeeper. And so you're going to, and that's, I guess, and if I can step back and look at this in terms of like, bigger picture, that's an interesting flip of the power dynamic, because in the past, when it came to Social Security, it was easy to beat up on unemployed people. It was easy to beat up on low-income people because they don't have access to lobby groups, accountants, lawyers. This time around, you have business owners who have access to, the business council. And so who's ultimately going to be made to pay this? I suspect it'll be passed to the employee, but I will wait to see.
I agree. I think it will be passed to the employee, but the upswing of the last 4 years is that you have groups like Not My Debt who have radically reframed the narrative around the unemployed and around Centrelink payments, whereas before, governments and Channel 9, Today Tonight, whatever, would, talk about dole bludgers and wasters and drug users and whatever. And now when they do it, we rattle them, we rattle the cage, and it's not just Not My Debt and, Lindsay and everybody else who is involved in that, in that amazing work that they did. It's that it seeded something bigger, and that you now have groups like AEW as well, which have learnt from those tactics and have taken the best of those tactics. And that's been something really inspiring, is to sit down with other activists and go, here's what worked. Here's how we do X, Y, Z, and this part worked, and this part didn't work, and we don't have to do that again. And that's a really inspiring thing to see amongst younger and upcoming activists, many of whom are, communications and media students who once wanted to be journalists and who are all out of work as well. So you have these highly trained young people who are all out of work or in gig economy and have too much time on their hands and lots of skills and lots of anger, and who are actually sitting down and talking to people who have run other campaigns before and getting the best out of it. And I'm really, really, really impressed by the work that's going on at the moment.
And that's, and then you zoom that out, so you have all those factors, and you have, factor in massive HECS debts, lack of access to jobs. Even if you're not connected to these organizations, there are a lot of people who are still curious and interested and involved somehow. And how that plays out over the next, 5 to 10 years is going to be really interesting, because, it's at some point, politics has to respond. It's just a question of how, when, and why. And you're already seeing with the pandemic. I mean, we put a million people unemployed now. So people who had no experience with the system prior, who potentially have mortgages, potentially have credit cards, potentially have, afterpay bills of some sort. Someone pointed out to me today, the South Australian Police have just arranged to allow to make it so that you can pay your fines using afterpay. So they've outsourced the actual repayment of those bills to this third-party company, and if you miss that payment, guess what happens? So but
it's a debt-to-prison pipeline that we're building here with the help of police and state revenue sort of compliance.
And even if you think about that, if you phrase it, and that's another element of this that I wish, I guess one area that I wish I'd done more on, is that debt to prison pipeline. If you look at places like Western Australia, infamously, if you weren't able to pay your fines and you were a debtor, you could be jailed for a certain period of time in order to pay your fines. And this led to the death in custody of Miss Jew and lots of other Indigenous people. And so I guess that's also a really critical element of this, is that how these, in terms of this widespread indebtedness, in terms of the impact of this, how this, the distribution of the effects of this is very different from if you live and work in a city, to if you work in a regional area, to if you're Indigenous, to if you're a refugee, to if you're a migrant, to if you're a woman. It breaks down in a variety of ways. And I guess, in the book, I talk particularly as well about one, the worst payday lending company in the country that began from this guy who was himself a debtor. He went bankrupt trying to start a glossy glamour magazine in Brisbane, and then started up this debt company that specifically targeted single mothers, people on social security, and Indigenous people. And it was very hard to write about without a sense of moral, without a moral reaction, because the cynicism behind it was just so extreme. Essentially, he relied on, like, whereas in the city, if people get into massive debts, debt collectors get sent after them. There's a whole court process. In very vast regional communities where the nearest ATM machine is literally 1,000 kilometers away, they relied on just taking as much as they could get and then running. So they somehow got into these remote indigenous communities, had word go around that they were, allowing people quick $200 cash loans through payday lending, and gave instructions for how to start a bank account and then how to apply for Centrelink, and then use their Centrelink as kind of collateral for the loan. Now, what would happen was people would get the cash in their account, think it was great, but then the interest on the account meant that their Centrelink payment was coming in and was being eaten up over time. And eventually that Centrelink payment would stop, and the payment would disappear. But by then they had got their money 3 times over, and they just wouldn't bother chasing the person up for the debt because there was no point. So this whole thing was an elaborate ruse. But so when you and I guess this goes back to, these things are able to survive and thrive when no one is watching, when no one is aware, when no one has the language to be able to understand what is happening and then call it out in very simple terms. And the more people start doing that, the harder it is to sustain it.
Yeah, and I think I'm forever regretful that as activists, we didn't have more capacity to work with remote and regional communities. Like, we did make phone calls, we did contact and include organisations that were from remote and regional areas in the Not My Debt organising. But really the first people who felt the impact of these systems were people who had already been crushed by colonialism, and that was Indigenous communities. They had the community development program, which was essentially saying, hey, if you don't walk 20 kilometres to work in the morning, we'll cut you off Centrelink. It's just slave labour. And again, with robo-debt, they had no way of contesting it because there was no, in some communities, access to phone or internet. How do you contest? How do you go and find your FOI of your own personal file? How do you find the information if you don't have access to comms in those communities? Robo-debt and other systems of automation harm those who have already been put in the worst situations to begin with first.
And that arguably is one of those, when it comes to the social security system and kind of how that's been stripped back, is that it does create a sense for a lot of people that of despair and of, and for people who have been interacting with it for a long time. But I guess, just going back to the point, I mean, when you screw up, you try to do better tomorrow. That's always the idea, so there's always a future to do more of this down the track. And it's just, I guess, and the other thing I'll say as well is that it's when you think about all those peripheral issues, all those individual issues as a group, when you look at, I guess, debt as a subject and how this plays out in terms of the human experience, it ties so much together. And I guess it's a way of thinking about things in a way that makes it so that this isn't just about, suddenly access to internet matters, suddenly this matters, all these things, all these things come together, but then the crisis is sparked because of this widespread indebtedness and the schemes people come up with in order to extract maximum value from the average person. And I guess that goes back, and then this then goes back to the fact that there are people, that the good work, people who are actually organizing, who are actually pushing back and saying no more. And I think that will continue.
I'm going to jump in here, unfortunately, because we are out of time for this evening, but I did want to ask one question, if that's okay. We've had a few come through, so I'm going to pick the one that most people are leaning towards, which is, if the prevalence of debt is a structural problem, then what are some of the policy solutions? And to tag on to the end of that, what about government debt? Is modern monetary theory something that you advocate?
So 2 parts. So first off, in terms of broadly speaking, public debt, because we're short on time, we'll be very clear. So government debt to be frank, doesn't matter so much in our current environment. Across the world, zero interest rates, governments can borrow money and then sell that debt as a financial product. Governments love doing this. Worldwide investors need safe assets. They love government debt. The big issue with government debt, how it plays out in our politics, is it's more used as a cudgel to shut down people who want to, your political opponents. If you want someone to be stopped in their tracks, all you have to do is ask them, how are you going to pay for this? And that's how that functions in terms of our politics. In terms of the policy solutions to this massive private debt that we have, this massive stock of private debt, I guess there are actually a lot of solutions out there. There are a lot of ideas that have been put forward by people, and these tend to go in two different directions. The first is top down. So you can approach this from the perspective of there's a certain type of tax you can put on in terms of how, to limit the creation of financial products and the financialization of debt and securitization, so that there's no more demand, and all those lawyers and accountants who, trade in those sorts of stuff can go do something else with their time and probably more, productive. There are other ways, and you can either do that as one big tax or a global tax, or as a death by 1,000 cuts and put a series of little ones together. That requires a government to actually do stuff. From the bottom-up approach, you have a couple of ideas that have been floated. The first one I think is actually really elegant, although I don't know how you would actually put this together in practice. It's the idea of a household union. So a lot of the deal with debt is that it focuses primarily on the average household, the average middle income household, and it's loaded up people with debt because of their various bills. So what you can do is, if you organize households together like unions of old, that union can then go negotiate contracts with different companies. And the more households you have signing on to this, the more weight they have, and the more that they can change at a moment's notice. So if there's a bad deal from one particular company, suddenly you don't just have one person quitting and going to the next place. Suddenly you have 100,000 people changing providers, and that tanks the company's share price. And so that tilts the power dynamic back in the version of the average person. The other way is a new idea called citizens' wealth funds. Basically, these function like sovereign wealth funds, except that rather than distributing money directly to governments, this money gets distributed to the average person through this kind of managed investment fund. And the idea being is that it puts more money in the average person's pocket, that they can then, they don't then feel so stressed because they have more money coming in, they can handle their debts, and we can start to level their level the playing field. The problem is that you need governments, you need politicians, we need people to actually do this stuff, and that requires pressure from the average person. It requires people saying, hey, there are ideas to solve this, let's do this. How and where that appears, I don't know. If I knew, I would be in politics, but I'm only here to be the journalist.
Thank you so much, Royce, and thank you, Asher, as well. Thank you both for such a fantastic discussion. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. Royce, you're on Twitter. I know that people can reach out to you there with those questions if they would still like to ask them after the event. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Thanks also to Aviva for that wonderful introduction. I'm now going to take everybody off mute so that you can all join me in thanking Royce and Asher and Aviva once again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Hello.
Some people didn't come off mute. There we go. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a lovely night.